Hello, welcome to Truespirations. My name is Nathan, and today we're going to talk about how do we awaken? What can we do in the process of awakening to facilitate that, to move that forward somehow? Um, Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, I think it's important just to review for those of you who missed the talk on what is awakening. It might be helpful to review what awakening is. It's kind of hard to know how to do something if you don't know even what that means. So fundamentally, what awakening means is that you drop out of the dream of human consciousness where we exist in a state of separation. And in particular, there's a focus for that separation called the I. We often would refer to this as the ego. And so when you say the word I, that refers to something tangible, something where you say, yes, that's me. I am whatever it is that you're identified with, whether that's your body or your story or your life or your job. But there's some sort of sense of I within whatever it is that you're pointing to. That's dreaming human consciousness. So awakening is when you have dropped out of that, when something shifts. And if you look for that I, it's just not there. You might have some memory of I, you'll still have conditioning. Once the I disappears, it's not like, the years and years and years of history that you have disappears along with it. It's just that you're no longer identified fundamentally with that conditioning and with that history and with those memories. It's just part of the experience that you're having, just the same as you might see clouds passing in the sky. We have that experience, but we don't identify with the clouds. We don't think I am that cloud. When you say I, it doesn't refer to a cloud somewhere inside. It's just an experience that you had in a moment. And so after awakening, it's the same thing. All of your thoughts, feelings, experiences, as much as in a certain way, you might have a sense of identity with it. When you look, there's a recognition that there's actually nobody inside of it. So that's what we mean by awakening as far as the experience of it. And then the energetics behind it, or how awareness has the experience of I and then goes to having the experience of not I. There is a series of energetic shifts in human consciousness that happen that starts with releasing all of these points of separation that sit along the spine. And then that moves into further shifts in consciousness where divinity emerges in different aspects of your energy system. And then eventually a little window appears in the center of that sense of I, which is this permanent window into awakening. And then at some point thereafter, and we think of it basically as by grace, that sense of I, which is generated by something called the core veil, that core veil drops away. And when the core veil drops away, that is synonymous with the beginning of awakening. Not, there is no, angels, singing praises and hallelujahs that, you have made it across the finish line. There is no finish line, but there is a nonlinear shift from all that has gone before, where there's this fundamental identification with the I, to crossing some threshold where that I just doesn't hold reality for you in the same way, in your perception and in your experience. So that's what it is to awaken. And for more details, you can check out the video that we already did and will be up on the website soon if it's not already. And so then the question is, where does awakening come from? Can we choose to awaken as an individual? There's all kinds of literature about it. It's even in our pop culture and in movies and whatnot. And so there's this idea that there's enlightenment or spiritual awakening, or some people call it ascension, although I don't personally resonate with that term. And so people think, wow, that sounds great. I want that. And so then they might go and read books or go to a teacher and decide, they want to awaken. And so they're going to, do some things. And maybe they know what those things are, or maybe they're just kind of flailing around, but they like the idea. And so they try and find a way. And the thing is that the ego cannot choose to awaken. The choice to awaken, it can't really come from the ego. If it comes from the ego, then there's something a little bit inauthentic about it, because to awaken means the ego dies, the ego just disappears. And the ego is so invested in its own survival that it ultimately can't, kill itself. It's sort of like the movie The Terminator. The Terminator cannot self-terminate. Somebody else has to do the final, dropping into the lava pit for the Terminator to die. And that's basically what our egos are: is a lean, mean machine that refuses to die and is incapable of choosing its own death. So instead, the choice has to come from a much deeper place. And in fact, there really is only one chooser in the entire cosmos, because once you come out of ego, you recognize that there is no separation. We're all we're all one. We're all part of the same dynamic universe. And whatever awareness or beingness or intention or choices that are being made, although there is an appearance of that happening individually, that I chose something, that's actually not how it works. There's only one chooser in the universe, and you can use whatever name you want for that. It could be, Buddha nature, or the one, or source, or God, or divinity, whatever it is. But that is what chooses. Everything else is just a play of the ego. And the ego will think, oh no, I got this calling from God. So clearly, I will be one of the ones that awakens. And again, it just doesn't really work like that. And as far as the ego is concerned, like I said, it doesn't really want to die. It just wants to escape its own suffering. And the ego does everything that it possibly can to escape suffering, not recognizing that the cause of suffering is the ego itself. The cause of suffering is separation consciousness, is the experience of being separate and cut off from what we really are, from divinity, from love, from source. Again, whatever word works for you. It is within that separation that we experience suffering. Now, the ego has its own sort of story going on, and it's always trying to find the angle. It's always trying to find a way to maneuver the situation to get what it wants out of it. And so for the ego, the choice to awaken is really just a game. It's just a play. It doesn't know it. It might be completely convinced that it really wants to awaken, but ultimately it doesn't, and it can't. And it's interesting, if you really trace any choice that you ever made, going back to the idea that there's only one chooser in the universe, your mind might deliberate and go back and forth and, make a list of pros and cons, or whatever your process is for making a decision. You go through that process, and then there's a recognition that a choice has been made. And so you go along with that choice. Now, there's a gap between all of this sort of processing and figuring out, the pros and cons, and the choice being made. There's this gap, there's this moment of stillness that might be, very, very short, but, there's the deliberation, and then there's the choice. And there's this gap in between, because all this deliberation is happening on a mind level and on an ego level. But that is not what makes choices. What makes choices is divinity, is, our true nature. What we really are is what makes choices. Our fake self, the false self, the ego, can think it makes choices, but it has no power. It has no oomph behind it. So the only thing that's making the choice is that which chooses, which is divinity. And so if you trace it back, and I think you'll find that there will be this deliberation, and then there's a moment where a choice is made. And then the ego claims that choice. It says, aha, I made a choice, and it's my choice. And goes on its merry way as if, that was really true. But in fact, it's actually just the one making that choice. And often, almost all the time, what we really are makes choices just kind of going along with the conditioning, just going along with the ego's game, because, why not? That's sort of part of the point, is to experience life as an ego. And so there's this kind of ongoing background choice to just kind of go along with whatever story the ego is taking you on. And so then it seems like the ego is making all these choices. But actually, it's just sort of like a parent who gives false choices to a child so they can feel like they can choose between going to bed now or going to bed in 10 minutes. Well, either way, you're going to bed. You don't actually get to make that choice, but we'll make it seem like you got to make a choice, and then everybody's happy. So anyway, I digress a little bit, but that's the dynamic at play, is when divinity is ready for the form to awaken, for whether it's this form or the form of your body, or of a plant or an animal, whatever it is, that is what initiates the movement towards awakening. It's that divine choice happening somewhere deep, deep down inside, someplace that we typically can't access from our conscious awareness. And, just relate the story of my sense is when that choice was made for me. This would have been when I was about 19 years old. And I started learning about Taoism. I read this book about a Taoist monk. And it was very odd how open I was to it, because I was such a militant atheist. And this is part of how, a choice was being made. And usually those choices align with our conditioning, but sometimes it doesn't. My conditioning up until that point would have been to just kind of mock the whole thing, the whole idea, like this religion around, Taoism, and what is the Tao, and what's all this martial arts they're doing, and they think they're channeling chi, and it all would just seem really, absurd to me. And yet a choice was made that broke from my conditioning and just decided to listen and to be open and to get whatever, positive wisdom I could out of it. And somewhere in there, it's like part of me was reading between the lines, like whatever it is that these Taoist monks were communing with and connecting to and interacting with on some level. It's like that was a story that was being told between the lines of the written book. And as I tuned into that story, or into that something that was happening between the lines, there was a recognition that what I was looking at was ancient and familiar. And the more that I tuned into it, the more I recognized that it was me. And it wasn't just me as an individual, but it was that which is inside everyone. What I'd been mocking for years in all these religions, including Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism, I suddenly had a direct experience of it. And I realized, oh, that's what everybody's been talking about. There's this thing that you can't really put words to, but it's real and it's there and it's what we are. And that is what initiated my search for awakening. At that point, I was like, wow, that's amazing. What is that? How did I not know that consciously? And yet I always knew it. And that sent me on the spiritual path that eventually, led to my own experience of awakening. And so it can be really random like that. There's a guy called Wayne Lickerman, who ironically enough was an abject alcoholic, Wayne Lickerman, who was an alcoholic. And he was just a drunk, and he had no desire to do anything except drink. And then one day he woke up physically, just, from his slumber, and the alcoholism was gone. He had absolutely no desire to drink. It had just disappeared, and with no explanation, there was no reason for it. And so that was the moment that he was like, wow, something uh, bizarre just happened, and I need to know what that is. I need to know where this came from. How was I healed from my alcoholism, or at least from the addiction of it, without even trying? And so he went, off on this search, and eventually he had his own awakening experience, because it was time. The one chose through him to awaken, and first he got that moment that changed his life, and then eventually his consciousness was able to catch up to that, and to have to awaken out of the rest of his conditioning, and to be in that awake state. So it's always just kind of fascinating how the divine gets us to where it wants to get to within us. So it's important that this call to awakening be authentic. You can't fake it. It can't be this snazzy thing that the ego decides that it wants to do. It just has to be real. And if it's real, you'll get there. And if it's not real, then you'll never get there. And so there's some surrender that's involved in that. If you sort of fight that and decide, no, I can awaken if I want to. Well, that's just the ego doing its thing again. And as long as the ego is in charge, then awakening can't happen. It's like, because awakening is where the ego disappears, the ego being in charge of the process is antithetical to what awakening really is. It would be like a fist trying to punch its way into being open. Like, as long as you're punching as a fist, you can't be open. It's a complete contradiction. The two are incompatible with each other. And why do all this? Like, this is a lot of effort. You might hurt yourself. There's a lot of drama involved in punching your way into an open hand, when instead of doing that, you just relax and let go and stop being a fist. And then you can be an open hand. So these are the things that something in you has to recognize at some point, not necessarily at the beginning, but somewhere along the way, it has to become clear, and you have to surrender to the truth of the ego just not being in charge of this. And even if you have that authentic calling, the ego will try and commandeer it and take it over and make it its own. And, to one extent or another, it will succeed. Because that's just the nature of the ego and our conditioning. And as long as you haven't awakened, there is an identity there with the ego. And so it's going to play out. But as long as you can kind of keep your eye on the prize and keep surrendering, then the ego, eventually will just kind of run out of gas, and will cease to have the ability to interfere with the process.